And welcome to the Radical World, the podcast. I'm Jose Leal. And today, my partner, Matt Perez, is not with us, but we do have a pretty awesome guest, which is Timm Urschinger. And Timm is in Switzerland, correct?
That's correct. Sitting in Basel, getting dark here.
Yeah, quite dark, actually.
Yeah.
Um, and I've been trying to chat with Timm for years, sort of off and on, haven't really made an effort, but uh, always thought, like, oh, I'm talking to his colleagues within his former organizations and thinking, oh, this Timm guy sounds interesting. I'd like to meet him too. And here we are. We get an opportunity to talk. And so the reason I wanted to talk to you is because it sounded like you had a very similar perspective to why we need to do change in organizational structures in the way we do work and the future of work, all of that kind of space. And it seems like, at least based on the name of your previous organization, it seems like we have a similar perspective. So that's what I'd love to explore. But before we do that, Timm, why don't you tell us why you kind of got into this space? What was your personal motivation? What was the background?
Sure. So first of all, pleasure. Thanks a lot for the invite. Not so sure about that. This is an interesting guy to talk to thing, but we'll figure that out maybe.
Well,
Anyway, so
we'll know by the end.
yeah, hopefully, right? And then hopefully you and the rest of the audience is not too disappointed, but we'll figure that out, I guess. And also what got me into the space, I guess, as I said, I'm in Basel, Switzerland, which is quite a big pharma biotech hub here. And when I started my career roughly 20 years ago, it was even more so. So I worked for big pharma, then I got myself into consulting, something like 15 years or so ago. And I didn't think about any of these topics, to be quite honest. It's not on the radar at all. I've done more
When you say consulting, what kind of consulting?
well, basically around the typical process efficiency, organizational
Okay, all
efficiency
right.
kind of stuff. So the
Change
usual
management.
consultancy thing. Yeah, totally. Even worse in the beginning, it was more project management, even that. But anyway, so yeah, and then I guess at 24, 25, I, for some strange reason, ended up becoming a team lead. And I had no clue about leadership. I had no clue about how to lead a team. So I just curious. And I was actually interested in psychology in the first place. I never studied anything that direction, but I found an interesting topic. So it was just looking around. You got a bit of sponsoring for getting a leadership training, whatever, and so then I figured it's actually an interesting space, and I could learn some things, and then you move from leading yourself into leading a team, leading an organization, kind of typical journey. But actually, what I also figured is that everything I've learned in these trainings and books and podcasts and whatever, we've basically done the opposite in our company. So I was like, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And then I'm just that naive 25-year-old guy challenging the rest of the management team basically on, this is what I learned and this is what we are doing, guys. That doesn't make, that doesn't look like it's the same thing. So anyway, I guess I've not made too many friends with these guys, but anyway, stayed on for a while. Got more into change management, got more into psychology, team development, high performing teams. Lencioni at that time was quite a big topic actually. So these things, and then the other thing that's true is that back in the days, the company was actually quite bureaucratic. It was a typical, yeah, if you want, financial controller type of setup for a consulting company. And being a team lead, I still thought I work with my team and I work with clients. And then I ended up signing off like 1,000 expense sheets every year. And I was like, that's nuts. A, is boring, and B, I figured there's not much value for the company anyway. So I got really frustrated about that stuff together with Frank back in the days, and then myself. We then quit the job. Obviously, we created our own company, which was called Life Sciences in 2016. And just about that time, actually in 2015, we've come across a book that's called Reinventing Organizations, and Frederick Laloux, who just last week actually celebrated 10 years Reinventing Organizations book. So anyway, I've read that over the summer in 2015 and thought, well, that's somewhere between naive and exciting, what he's describing there. And then at the same time, you're like, well, we're about to start our own company, so what better opportunity do you have to just try out some of these concepts? So basically, we got hooked into Teal and self-organizing companies and all that. And since then, 9 years from here, basically, we I'm about that stuff is holding us back in many ways. I'm convinced that organizations struggle with bureaucracy. So yeah, here we are. That's in a nutshell.
Yeah, I was going to mention the 10th anniversary because it's pretty cool that we're talking about it just as it's kind of being celebrated around the community. Um, how much of an impact did it make on you? Like, I mean, you kind of changed the way you were going to do your organization because of it, or were you already going to do it differently and that kind of helped frame it a little differently?
I was really, that sounds a bit romantic maybe, but I think it was life changing in many ways. And one is we look at organizations, and the only thing I knew, and Frank and I knew both, I think, at that time, was we knew what we didn't want. We had no clue how different could look like. So Frederick and his book actually helped shape a bit of an idea, I guess, and helped us kick it off, try out things and whatnot. But I mean, Frederick's obviously focused on the organizational consciousness part. But then if you dive into some of these concepts, if you look at wholeness and also the tension-based management and these kind of things, then obviously, if I look at my personal development journey and some of these more uncomfortable insights that I gained over the last 10 years or so, that's been obviously life-changing as well. So I do look at the world differently. I'm quite sure. Yeah.
So you chose to talk about beyond bureaucracy and ego organizations. What does that mean to you, ego organizations? We'll start at the back and move forward, or move towards the front.
Fair enough. First of all, there's probably a more philosophical discussion around: are we all, as human beings, driven by some kind of egoistic ideas? Even if you are, altruistic from an outside perspective, do you do that to, feed your own ego in a sense of I am needed, I feel like I'm needed, kind of stuff? So this is a bit of a fundamental belief that I have, is like we all do things from egoistic ideas, and that doesn't hurt as long as it's coming from a mindset of abundance, from a growth mindset, and these kind of things, I think. Now, the other observation, and as I said, I'm coming from the big pharma world, but any big corporation really, the bigger the corporation gets, the more ego and politics comes into the game. And even in our small consulting company, whatever, 10, 15 years ago, only 100 people, so it's not tremendous organization, but many of the things were driven by, let's just say, individual belief sets, like individual wealth, career, status, whatever it might have been. Right? And what I figured is that's not necessarily always or actually rarely is it the best for the organization, for the broader good. Now that's even just looking at an organizational lens. If you look at the last few years, then we are discussing more and more the societal lens as well. The multi-stakeholder kind of setup, or even just triple bottom line and these kind of conversations. So I do think, if you look at the world around us, then it's obviously driven by consumerism and by ego and, bigger, faster, that kind of stuff.
So one of the things that, that leads me to a whole bunch of different questions and comments and thoughts. But the first thing that, and maybe we're jumping into the pool here in our conversation, but do we need organizations anymore, really? Like in the form of something that is independent from us? And I'm not saying about changing the status quo in the world of business, because obviously the status quo is the status quo and it will continue for a while. But as we start new things that will serve life, serve our communities, serve the people that that need to be served, which is all of humanity and life itself, how do you see organizations moving forward when we kind of place organizations as a human being in our laws, in our systems of organizing, and then we then serve the organization rather than serving those things I've just mentioned, because now the organization needs to stay alive. The organization is what we're all trying to make profitable and make better, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. And I guess it's probably depend a bit on what's the definition of what an organization is, and do we need that thing, or not. There's things that we've seen the last decade around the gig economy, a lot more decentralized and democratized setups, blockchain, obviously, DAOs,
DAOs, right?
these kind of things. And I do think there's a human need for belonging and for community. And
Absolutely.
now the DAO colleagues would probably say, Tim, you didn't get the concept, but I would say I'm not sure if DAOs get us that, for example. Right?
Totally
Now,
agree with that.
so and I'm sure we can have proper conversation on that. But that's my personal belief. So having said that, I do think there's a need for some kind of thing that we would probably
Community.
call an organization, which is built on community, which is built on belonging, which is also built on a broader sense and impact or purpose, you could call it, if you use Frederick's words from from the reinventing organizations. So that I do believe we will need. Now, that said, our economic system and global economy is not built on any of these. Right? It's built on consumerism, and it's
Right.
built on profits, basically. And then
Right.
also you could say serving a few by exploiting the broader community in a way. So
An extraction.
this is probably where totally, yeah. And this is where probably I would say this is where the beyond bureaucracy, beyond ego kind of thing will probably require a bit of a shift. Now, if we look at people like Gary Hamel, who's written Humanocracy, was it 4 years ago, 5 years ago now, then he would also say, well, that means there's a bigger systemic shift that we need. And the question comes back to what you said, I think. Is that going to happen? When is it going to happen? At which scale is it going to happen? And this is a bit, I guess, one of the bigger. And I'm actually curious to hear your view how COVID, for example, accelerated or decelerated in the last 2 years that kind of trend or not. And that's one of the big questions, I think.
Well, from my perspective and the work that we've been doing, I think it's accelerated that transition. More and more people, organizations, groups that we talk to were driven by the reality that life was very different during that period of time. And that going back into the rat race really felt different because they had the opportunity to back away from it and going back into it, the commuting, the time checking, and this, you have to be here at 9, yeah, you have to leave it, all of the kind of stuff that for a lot of us we don't feel that anymore. But the vast majority of people still feel that old way of working, right? And so I think a lot of people here in the United States, at least in the Bay Area, we've sensed that in a big way. There was an announcement that our train system here in the Bay Area has, after all this time, after COVID, has reached 78% of what the capacity was before.
Wow.
Right?
Crazy.
Even to this day, like this much time long. So something's changed.
Yeah.
Right? Something's changed. And the roads seem to be a little bit less busy. And so, things have changed to some degree. And the number of organizations that have tried to force people back into the office, right? I don't know if you've heard the story, but there was a story, one of our banks here in the United States, I can't think of the name of it right now, but it'll come to me. One of the employees that they forced to come into the building because, you can't work from home anymore. You have to come back in. That person actually didn't work with a team, not a local team. Her team was distributed. So she was working by herself in a corner of some floor of some building that she had to travel to for an hour and a half or 2 hours. She died. And they didn't discover her for 4 days.
Wow.
So that's a kind of proof of what's happening, right? Where there's the disconnect and we don't know how to follow the old system and still honor the human needs, right? You talk about belonging. Belonging wasn't being served, right? But that was the intent, is that you're going to be able to too many quotes. But that was the intent of the old system, is you be in here because you're going to work with your colleagues, even though she wasn't. So I agree with you that a lot of these changes are happening and have been happening. And you mentioned, Gary's work and, the reinventing organizations and the teal movement and all of these other things that are happening. And there's two scales, right? There's we need to make some improvements in the way we work, how we organize ourselves, how we do meetings, how we do all of this stuff. And a lot of work has been done on that. My sense is that work kind of takes 2 steps forward and 1 step back when it meets the reality of the organization, because the organization hasn't really changed. Some processes have changed within it, some approaches, but the organization hasn't really changed. And you bring in somebody in, and things are back to the same kind of thing. First of all, do you agree with that? And second, how do we make change that's more fundamental than the tweaks and the adjustments and the approaches that we've been doing? Many of us have been trying for a few years now, some of us for 10, 15. Doug from Morningstar Farms, he's been at it since the 90s, right? And doing a lot of work. How do you see that? Because I see that there's a lot of stuff being done at this level, but it needs a change in that other level for it to really be able to have staying power and not just be sort of for the moment.
Yeah. No, totally with you. And I think so. I had a conversation with Gary Hamel 2 or 3 years ago, and I'm not sure if he would still say the same, to be honest. But back then he said, you will not be successful in transforming, for lack of better word, an organization, because the system around the organization is not built for that kind of idea. Right? So that level of consciousness of the organization, like Frederick would probably describe it in Reinventing Organizations, is quite useless, at least to sustain that idea, if you have a system, let's just call it global economics, that is not built on that consciousness level. Right? And I actually had a conversation with Bill Anderson, who's now the CEO of Bayer and doing this dynamic shared ownership thing that's quite visible these days. 5-6 years ago, when he was still at Roche here, and we discussed the question: is there like a critical mass, like a point of no return? Doesn't matter what Timm or Jose think, right? If there's like 15,000 people, 10,000 people, 20,000 people in the organization work differently, you're beyond that point of no return. Right? And back then I said, Bill, I do think there is that point of no return. You've just gone too far. And actually I would disagree now with myself, like 5-6 years later, because I do think that it's dependent on a few people at the top, because of how the system and how the economic system is built, actually. Right? And if you look at Roche, if you look at ING Bank in the Netherlands and Belgium, if you look at all sorts of companies across the globe, in fact, it's always dependent on that consciousness level of that individual kind of at the top of that organization. Right? So, and now if you mentioned the work from home kind of thing, Dell, for example, just this week announced that you got to be back in the office. And Dell is obviously a technology company. So I guess you have more of these individuals that you described for that bank, where it's like, you work globally anyway, you work virtually most of the time. So what's the point? And I do think it's like, the level of uncertainty increases in global economy, with all the wars and everything going on, but also interest rates and whatnot, inflation. Yeah. And the higher the uncertainty is, the more people try to control something that is obviously an illusion to be controlled. But, you still try that. It's kind of a human instinct, I guess. So if you then have, corporate leaders, if you want to call it that way, who've not, thought through that stuff, or wouldn't be at that, conscious level. If you ask Gary or Frederick, probably, then I would say you revert back to the patterns and themes that you know. So it's almost like a counter movement, I would say.
Yeah, and I agree with Gary that we need, in order to change. So I started where I think you may have started, which is, if we change the way we see each other and act with each other, things will be different. And the organization will come secondary.
Yeah.
And I evolved to, and this speaks to Frank's point, a higher purpose is great, but a higher purpose within a jail cell is horrifying, right? Like, imagine having a higher purpose, but you can't move outside of the jail cell, right? And now what do? I can't express that higher purpose because I'm confined, right? And thank you, Frank, for your comment. And it's, for me, there's a third step now emerging for me, which is, yes, it is about purpose. Yes, it is about serving life and us wanting to serve life in a way that we each can and want and have the desire to do uniquely. It is about coming together in a new way that's not bureaucratic, that's distributed, that's peer-to-peer, that's about a sense of transparency of each other's purposes and recognizing the value that we bring to the table, rather than sort of creating a purpose that drives us to do things, sort of like we're following a purpose again, rather than allowing our own purpose to drive what we're doing. But then there's the structure piece. And we call our current economic system and work system the fiat system. Because much like the currency, it is worth this much, I tell you so. It is a dollar. It is a fiat dollar, which comes from this concept of the kings, where we say, well, this is a boss, and he can be a good boss or a bad boss. You have no choice. These are the systems. It's our systems, and you have no choice. And we have this organization, and you have no choice. My sense is that the structure of organizations as a whole, how organizations work, their role in society as a whole, needs to change. So it's not just us, it's not just how we organize, but it's also what is an organization. And that goes back to the conversation, do we need organizations? And what role does a new type of organization take? Because we're inside a system, this fiat system, that says it's a top-down hierarchical process, right? The government allows for a company to exist. A company has shareholders and owners and leadership, and then they can do whatever they want within their fiefdom, which we said wasn't okay. We said we want a democracy in our world, but within this fiefdom, democracy does not exist for the most part.
Agreed.
Right?
Agreed. Yeah.
So how do we then take away that ability for that fiefdom to exist? Because that's part of the problem, right? The second somebody owns a company, they legally have the right to do whatever it is that they want to do within it.
Yeah. Oh, true. And probably there's different ways of answering that. I mean, technically speaking, I was also owning a company, like a year back, and we've never had a, let's just say, governing system around limiting, at least legally, my power. So legally speaking, I had all the power. Obviously, Frank and I actually had that conversation with the whole team some point in time 3 years ago or something. It's like, well, guys, technically Frank and I don't know how much we owned, like 80% of the company or something. So we could have decided anything legally, right? Anything. And we had a conversation with the team, like, what do we do about it? Do we put a governance in place to limit that, or what do we do? And they basically said, well, we don't care, we trust you. So this was the simple answer. So we never did anything about it. So I guess that's one part of the answer. You don't necessarily have to do something about it. Now the other part is you could obviously build a structure and a governance around it. I think the other part that could be interesting as well is if if the hypothesis is that the most important asset of any organization is their people, then you could theoretically vote with your feet and say, look, that fiefdom that Jose just built doesn't work for me, right? And we see that partially. I think we don't see that everywhere. That's probably one due to privilege as well.
It's pretty hard to walk away when the
Exactly.
rent needs to be paid, and
Exactly.
da, because the whole system is designed to extract through you.
Exactly.
Right? We are the vehicles of extraction. Extraction doesn't happen without us.
Yeah, exactly. Which is then coming back to, I guess, Frederick's new idea around the week. This more sustainability oriented story there, where he basically says, if you want to change that, many of these things actually, then the only thing is you need to have a paradigm shift away from more and more and more and consumerism, basically, to get one step back individually as well on what do we actually really need. Like, do I need to have all of these gadgets and things and whatnot? Do I really need like 5 cars and I don't know, whatever else, right? So that's a bit the other kind of the theory that's there's is like, okay, we all talk about that higher consciousness, and then I'm sitting there with my whatever 20th phone of these ones, right?
Right.
So
Right.
does that actually fit the picture or not? Right? So
No,
this is also
I
an
want to say
interesting one.
mine is a little bit smaller and older.
Fair enough.
But no different, right?
Exactly.
We're all guilty of the same thing. So what we're saying is it's a systemic thing, and tweaking an enclosed part of the system, making it a little bit better, doesn't change the system.
Correct.
Right?
No.
It isolates to some degree from the system, but it doesn't change the system. It simply isolates to some degree.
Exactly.
And
Which is then part of the conversation, which is, do we need an evolution, or do you need to make the old system obsolete and replace it by something new? And there's quite some people actually would say evolving the current system is not possible. You need to replace it with something better. Yeah.
well, and Frank is commenting about AI tools and so forth. Any idea of changing the system by people, I don't think was possible until all of the technology and the tools that we have today existed, and the level of education. Right? When Taylor was doing his thing, huge amounts of people were coming from farms with 1 or 2 years of education, going into factories and not having structure other than that live structure of living in a farm. And to make it work, that structure, some kind of structure, needed to be established. It was pretty harsh structure, in my opinion, the way that it was designed, the way that it was thought of, but it got us to this point.
No.
Right? We're in an inflection point, and that as Frank is pointing out, the capabilities we have now of this inflection point is the point that allows us to move forward. And Frank, I'm not saying that organizations aren't necessary. What I'm wondering is it okay to have an organization that has more power than people and is tied to the system so strongly that, again, changing anything within the organization really does not change the system, right? And can we actually alter the way we see an organization, right? I personally have this view that a new kind of organization is necessary. And you've been around this space quite a while. You've played with this for quite a while, and you're working now with EY to do some of this research, to do some of this work. My sense is, if we think of an organization not as a thing, but as a happening that's fluid, that's reactive, that comes in and melds like a murmuring, where more people come into this organization and then leave and then come in when it's necessary and join together when it's a nice warm night out. But then disband when they need to go and do the thing and then come back. And are we capable of that now?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's so maybe question to you, and then I probably have a point of view as well. But
Please.
Is that a question that of privilege, or is that, if you look at equity around the globe, literacy, health, wealth, all sorts of things, then that kind of concept, let's just call it a more fluid type of organizational idea, right? A happening. I quite like that term, actually. But is that a reality, say, in Uganda, where, still, I don't know, I'm just making up, 95% of the economy is based on farming, right? I'm guessing literacy level is pretty far away from the Bay Area or Basel, right? Level of wealth, obviously completely different. Even the whole access to technology, democratization generally on many of these topics is a different story. And certainly if you talk about equity in all sorts of other spaces like health or whatever, is totally different story. So is that a thought that you and I have, because we are, privileged white men in actually rich countries or areas of a country, right?
Even
Or
richer areas, yeah.
Yeah, totally. Even richer in that specific nation, right? Is that something that's actually kind of doable or thinkable across the globe?
I think it's actually more doable in non-rich areas.
Oh, yeah? Okay, how is that?
It's interesting. The people who want to hold on to what we've got are the people who have got it.
Oh, okay, got it. Yeah.
Right?
Hmm.
When I talk to people in Brazil, they're much more open to the idea.
Okay.
Mexico, much more open to the idea. Right? Azores, Portugal, way more open to the idea. The more they are disengaged from the system, the less they are bound by it, number one. Because the system does, we call it the fiat system for a reason. It traps you, it controls you, it engages you with it, whether you know it or not. And it's through systemic processes. It's not like with a gun to your head. It's just, oh, you need money, you need to have a home, you need to have a mortgage, therefore you need to work. If you need to have a good job. It's only the big companies that pay you lots of money. That system draws people up it. And the further up they are, the more trapped they are.
Yeah.
And so my sense is that in some ways, the extreme low end of what you described, there are experiments going on right now in Kenya with community currency. They're not happening here in the States.
Wow.
Right? They're happening there because there's flexibility in the system. And people with their phones are able to exchange currencies, regular cell phones, not smartphones, exchange currencies and pay each other for activities that are happening, building homes, doing farming, so on and so forth. But what's your opinion? What do you think?
So obviously not a straightforward black or white question, I think.
Of course,
right?
of course, of course,
So,
of course.
but I think you're right. I mean, if you think about it from pure change network analysis type of theory, right? Then you would say, well, true change has to start in the periphery and not in the center, because the center is too much to lose. It's always change starts in the periphery, and once you created enough kind of gain, then people in the center will go, oh, I can't miss that train, right? Because then I look stupid, I would lose everything and whatnot. So from that perspective, it makes sense. Now the other question is, the equity or the privilege question, I think, comes in on literacy and educational level, right? Because you and I, we rich enough, we just sit around, read books, and get into all of these theories, and then we came up with new models. Now, if my sole focus of the day is to survive somehow the day, and get a little bit of food at least, then it's a whole different story, I think. So I would agree. There's less risk, in a sense, making the system obsolete that doesn't work for me, doesn't feel dangerous, right? And at the same time, I'm probably kind of in my day-to-day hamster wheel, if you want, much more so I can't rethink the system. Back to Gary Hamel's point of, you can't evolve, you just need to make it obsolete, right? So that's a bit the question, I think. Yeah.
And that, I agree with that completely, right? It's not about transforming what we've got, and it's not about breaking it down. It's about letting it die a slow death, because it's no longer serving us. That's the game, right? It's not about, we know it's no longer serving us. We know, that gig work and other forms of organization are emerging for a reason, right? Because it's possible, because the technology provides for it, and so on and so forth. And for me, this idea that organizations we've created this world where we say there is an organization, that organization has this power, has this ability, has more power in many cases than governments.
Great.
And we can't have any influence on that organization. We can to some degree in governments, and yet, the most powerful organizations, really pretty much no one can play with them. So to me, there's a disconnect between the type of work that we've been talking about, making organizations internally less bureaucratic, less about people's egos, and still having an organization that's structured in that way. And for me, then the question is, how do we see a transformation adopting? And I think you're right. It is about the fringe, right? It's small businesses. Imagine if today, say 10%, 20% of small businesses were a new kind of organization, built on all of those principles we've been talking about, but collaborative and open, and not proprietary and competitive and extractive. And that community of small businesses evolves to compete with the large organizations that exist, not for business, because it's not about competing for business, but compete for the individuals who are about to get into the workplace and say, do I go there or do I go there? Right? I've told this before on the podcast, but I think it's an important point right now. 100 years ago, thereabouts, we had a revolution. In 1905, we had 8,000 cars in the United States. By 1920, 25, we had 18 million cars in the United States. in a period of roughly 20 years, millions of horses became unemployed. Millions, literally millions of horses became unemployed. Not because anybody was trying to kill horses, but because any young family that was going to need a mode of transportation by default picked the better mode of transportation. What if we create a better mode of working holistically, not a better way of acting and doing a department or doing meetings or organizing a team in an organization, but holistically change what an organization is, what a community of organizations is, and provided that as a place, an outlet for people who want to do something different than the organizations that are available to them today, the type of work that's available to them today.
No. Oh, totally. And it might not be in the first place. You make the whole idea of a, let's say, traditional organization obsolete. But to Jeff's point in the chat as well, with Henry Ford and also Kellogg's, we've seen that. I mean, across Europe and I guess to an extent across the globe, we're discussing the 4-day work week.
Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, Kellogg's had that in the 1930s already, right? And then went away from it for certain reasons. But basically, they had that already. Or before Henry Ford went to the 5-day work week, we had usual 7 days.
Mm-hmm.
No,
Mm-hmm.
nobody would question why we have a 5-day work week these days in most places, right?
Right.
So there's also that part. We always talk about making systems obsolete, which I think makes perfect sense. But the system mightn't always be the organization, whatever that is, right? Might be a certain concept within organizational life or work life or something like that as well.
Yeah, and I would argue that if we mandate a 4-day work week, then we're going down the wrong path again, right? That it needs to emerge that I have enough within 4 days and that I have the flexibility to live within that paradigm. Otherwise, we're back to the same thing. Let's go 4 days, but I want to work more, and nobody wants to hire me for more, and so on and so forth.
Exactly.
This has been a really nice conversation. I hope it was for you as well. I certainly enjoyed it.
Definitely. Thank you. It's really nice new insights, things about that I've not necessarily think about every day. So really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Well, from the beginning, I had hoped that we would end up with something more than what we started with, and it sounds to me like we did.
I think so.
And I appreciate your thoughts, and I appreciate your sense that it is more complicated than the things that we've been as a community all trying out, and how do we take it to the next level? How do we step up as a community again? Because this isn't about one organization changing anything, but as a community of forward-leaning organizations thinking about how we do this mutually. Well, thank you for the work that you've been doing. Thank you for the thinking you've been doing, and thank you for taking the time to join us here today, because I think we've had a conversation worth thinking about, worth pondering, and possibly worth rehashing maybe in a few months, just to see what has evolved since then.
Absolutely. Thank you for the invite as well. Pleasure, and happy to come back in half a year and then say the opposite of what I said today. Probably.
It's not wrong to say something different. It's only smarter to say something different as you evolve. We usually stop at 40, but it's been a little bit longer because we've had a good conversation. So, Timm, again, thank you very much. And hopefully we'll see you in 4 or 6 months.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, cheers.
Cheers. Bye.
And thank you to everyone's comments. Oh, yes, we do have a guest next week. Thank you, Carlos. Next week, we've got Joanna Stanisveska, who is a marketing director at Crunch Geek. Joanna and I have had some conversations around how do we see connection as part of this transformation that Timm and I talked about today. Timm and I mentioned meaning, and meaning comes through connection. And so, what's the role of connection in the current Fiat model, and how do we think about it moving forward? So, looking forward to that conversation. Thank you, Carlos, for pointing out that I would miss that, and we'll see you next week.